Thompson and William Cullens are two poets of the 18th century who are important because one gives us a sense of nature and the psychology of man living in nature, man's place in the cosmos. The other, William Cullens, gives us a more psychological, well, perhaps not a more psychological, but a series of poems with psychological importance. We're going to look at James Thompson first, and then we're going to look at William Cullens. James Thompson, if you look on the screen, was born in 1700 and died in 1748. Relatively short life. He was a Scottish poet, born in Ednam, Roxburghshire, and lived his boyhood in the valley of Jed, which was a river, a tributary of the Scottish Tweed. He actually grew up in the same region as Sir Walter Scott. His poetry is known for its nature, for its study of the physical environment, for its understanding of nature within the cosmic world, and to a large extent, what he gives us is a deistical perception of the world, a world based on God, but not dealing with religious sects. He first wrote the poem Winter as a set of poems he was writing on the seasons in 1726. Then in 1727 wrote Summer. In 1728 wrote Spring. That's about the time that Jonathan Swift was writing Gulliver's Travels. 1725 is when Pope wrote his edition of Shakespeare. He also wrote a poem sacred to the memory of Sir Isaac Newton. Now you don't have that in your text, but we are going to discuss it today because I think it's a relatively important poem for us to understand in the 21st century. He was concerned about politics, and he wrote a poem called Liberty in 1735 and 36. This is basically a Whig-oriented poem. He claimed here that liberty was attained in Greece and Rome, that it was lost in the Middle Ages and in degenerate Italy. Liberty claimed was renewed amongst Germanic tribes. And finally he says, liberty was won in England. A source of this information, at least this perspective, you'll find in the Tillotson English Literature from Dryden to Burns. The final version of the Seasons came out in 1744 and was finally published, revised again, in 1746. In 1748 he wrote The Castle of Indolence, which is an imitation of Spenser's style, and a poem that would very well interest some of you who are writing or haven't yet decided on what your research paper is going to be about. He was also a playwright and earned some money writing plays. This was a very lucrative field. He wrote a play called Sophonisba in Drury Lane, which was played in Drury Lane Theatre in 1730. Another Agamemnon in 1738. Edward and Eleonora in 1739. But by then the Licensing Act had prevented new plays from being shown on the stage. Robert Walpole was so incensed by stage attacks on the government that he closed all the legitimate theaters in 1737, and they did not open again for 10 years. He wrote Alfred, a Masque, in cooperation with a Scottish poet by the name of David Mallet, and the song Rule Britannia comes from that source. Now what we'd like to do is first of all look at these poems that he's written called The Seasons. I'm only going to look at 2 seasons before we get to winter, which is in your text, but in an early version and an abbreviated version. I'm going to show you what the difference is between the abbreviated version and the later version. This poem, The Seasons, would be considered a descriptive, didactic, reflective, physico-theological poem. And it is considered deistic because it doesn't focus on any sectarian impulse. It's neither Roman Catholic, nor Presbyterian, nor Quaker. It is a view of the way the world is created and by God and inhabited by man. When you talk about something that is descriptive, he's going to use the Georgic technique, whereby you take all sorts of ideas. You take people's occupations, you take the land, you take animal life, you take crops, and you transform them into a poem. This imitates Virgil's Georgics. When you talk about didactic, his purpose is to teach you how the world should behave and to show you the problems one confronts living in the world. Reflective, this is the sublime element of the poem. You're looking about you. You're looking at the wonders about you. You're looking at the expansiveness about you. You're looking at the terrors that might confront you. And then you're dealing with the physico-theological. What is the physical world? And what is its relationship to God? What is its relationship to theology? How do we understand our religious spirit within the environment we're dealing with? Well, if you look at the poem Autumn, just to give you an outline, he first of all says he's going to discuss autumn. Then he's going to address a patron, a Mr. Onslow. He's going to look at the fields ready for harvest. And he's going to look at reflections in praise of industry raised by that view. Who are the people that made this farm or readied this farm for harvest? He'll tell you a short story about some experience a person has had in the autumn season. He'll describe a harvest storm. We don't have any problems recognizing the fury of storms when they come up in Houston. He talks about people going on animal shoots and hunts. Thompson was a man who was concerned about human rights. He was concerned about problems with the prison system. He seems to be concerned here with animal rights because he considers the hunt a barbarity, and to his mind it's unnecessary. It is an unnecessary onslaught on animal life, and therefore he laughs at fox hunting. Why do people take it so seriously, and how foolishly they look when en masse they're chasing this little animal fleeing from them. Then he pictures the orchard. Everyone had orangeries or various orchards where they grew fruit. Unlike you and me, with the benefits of the valley in Texas, we have oranges all year round. In England, it was a rare fruit. And when it was time to grow, people sought it, relished it in the short period of growth they had for gaining these fruits. We're spoiled in Texas. We get oranges, we get watermelon, we get mangoes, we get fruit all year round because of the richness of the valley. He describes wall fruit. Wall fruit would be grapes, a vineyard, and then a description of fogs frequent in the latter part of autumn. He waxes eloquently about the rise of fountains and rivers, why they're important, where they flow, who feeds off them. Birds of the season are considered that shift their habitation. They fly north in the summer and south in the winter. He talks about the prodigious number of birds that cover the northern and western Isles of Scotland, and then he views the country in general. He looks at the discolored fading woods as dusk comes, and then finally focuses in this autumn on the autumn moon and moonlight. Now your book has in it, at least you are admitted only to a small part of this poem, you're admitted to winter. And if you look at your text, you're really dealing with a relatively small poem, a poem of about 400 lines. But the fact of the matter is that when Thompson expanded his poem, he went up to 1,096 lines. And I'm going to show you first what he has here, and then how he expanded the poem in a meaningful way. So, look at the poem Winter in 1726. He starts by recognizing how furious and how difficult it is living in the cold of winter. See, winter comes to rule the varied year, sullen and sad, with all his rising train. Winter here is personified as an old man. Vapors and clouds and storms, be these my theme, these that exalt the soul to solemn thought and heavenly musing. Welcome kindred glooms. Horrors hail. With frequent foot pleased have I, in my cheerful morn of life, when nursed by careless solitude I lived, and sung of nature with unceasing joy. Now when he says, see winter comes, and I sing of joy, this of course comes from Virgil's Georgics, of arms and the man I sing, but he sings of nature and he sings of storms. Go to line 40. You see the season changing from autumn. Now solitary and in pensive guise. Oft let me wander o'er the russet mead, the meadow. What is he going to see there? Or through the pining grove. The grove is pining because its fruit is fallen. Where scarce is heard one dying strain to cheer the woodman's toil. Winter's coming, things are dying. Far through the withering copse, meanwhile the leaves that late the forest clad with lively green, nipped by the drizzly night and sallow-hued, fall wavering through the air. The leaves are turning colors, and the leaves are falling from the trees. Or else, urged by the breeze that sobs amid the boughs, they are blown about. What are the rabbits doing? What is the wildlife doing as winter comes? They're perking up and they're looking for shelter and building their nests. Line 50, then listening hares forsake the rusting woods, and starting at the frequent noise, escape to the rough stubble and the rushy fen. How about the birds, the woodcocks, o'er the flittering, fluctuating main that glimmers to the glimpses of the moon, stretch their long voyage to the woodland glebe. So, they've been on a long voyage, or they're going to begin a long voyage, and they're on the way out. What's happening in night? What's happening in winter? Lines 57. Now nature droops. Nature droops. She is in despair because the fruition that she brought has now deteriorated, grown rotten. Languish the living herbs with pale decay, and all the various family of flowers their sunny robes resign. No more yellows, no more reds, no more bright flowers. They're resigned to death and decay. The falling fruits through the still nights forsake the parent bough. And there we have winter. Let's look at line 111, where he really describes the advent of winter. For see where winter comes, himself confessed, striding the gloomy blast. What happens first? First, rains obscure drive through the mingling skies with tempests foul. So the odors are there. The smell is not fresh. They beat on the winter storm beats on the mountain's brow and shake the woods that sounding wave below. And so you see the wind blowing the woods. The dreary plain lies overwhelmed and lost. The bellying clouds combine. The bellying clouds? The clouds have their bellies full, and they're going to empty out relatively shortly. Now, line 119. The wanderers of heaven, each to his home retire, save those that love to take their pastime in the troubled air, and skimming fluttered round the dimply flood. Now, what kind of line is that? What kind of birds stay about? First of all, the wanderers of heaven are birds. The wanderers of heaven, each to his home retire. So most of them go back to their nests. But there are some, the eagle, the falcon, who fly with the wind. Whether the wind is stormy, whether the wind is calm, they adapt to the wind. And they'll swoop down and grab in their talons fish in the water. And that's what we have here. Let's look at it again. The wanderers of heaven each to his home retire, save those that love to take their pastime in the troubled air, and skimming flutter round the dimply flood. Now, why is the flood dimply? Well, if you ever looked at a lake and saw the rain come down on it, you see all the spots, and it dimples. So the dimply flood is the rain coming down, and you get a rather impressive, picturesque image of what nature is doing and how it looks. You've got a poet as a photographer trying to catch every moment of the scene and telling you what you are looking at. Who else is there? The cattle from the untasted fields return. Why are the fields untasted? Because they're being flooded over. You can't get to the roots. You can't get to the shrub. And they ruminate in the contiguous shade. Well, contiguous shade is shade that comes and goes. So you have sunlight coming through the shade, and you've got the alternation of colors. Again, if James Thompson were a photographer in the 20th century or the 21st century, he would know how to photograph natural scenes. He would show us the contiguous shades, and he would show us the dimpled water. The crested cock with all his female train, pensive and wet. So now you've got the rooster in the farmyard with all the chickens about him, and they are running about wet. While the owner of the house, the cottage swain, is inside resting by a fire. Now, how does the storm evolve? At last the muddy deluge pours along, resistless, roaring, dreadful down it comes from the chapped mountain and the mossy wild, tumbling through rocks abrupt, and you see the rain swishing, coming down the mountainside. You may ask yourself, what makes these images so vivid? It's the poet at work. It's the poet using detail. It's the poet using concrete images. Look, roaring down, chapped mountain, mossy wild, tumbling through rocks, abrupt. This is the force of the storm. Now, this poem is somewhat different from other poems you've read because, number one, it is still in iambic pentameter. Look at the line. At last the muddy deluge pours along. Resist this roaring, dreadful down it comes. From the chapped mountain and the mossy wild, tumbling through rocks abrupt and sounding far. Iambic pentameter, but it's unrhymed. It's like Milton's Paradise Lost, giving you an epic view of the world, but through natural scenes. Now, if you turn to line 205, you'll see that nature deceives man. And these difficulties move man from self-dependence to being very dependent on nature. And now, ye lying vanities of life, you ever tempting, ever cheating train, where are you now? And what is your amount? These are scenes, wild, disjointed visions past and broken slumbers. Man is not going to be able to overwhelm the winter. Now, this poem does not get into narrative aspects the way the completed poem does. What I'd like to do now is turn to the completed poem and look at winter in one other guise. Because in winter we have here a different type of story. We have a poem that grew from 405 lines in 1726 to 1,096 lines in 1746. And this poem has a greater social concern. So let's look at it for a few moments. Here we see a man who is a laborer who is coming home in the winter snow. The works of man drooping, the laborer ox stands covered with snow, and then demands the fruit of all his toil. So oxen want food. The fowls of heaven, tamed by the cruel season, crowd around the winnowing store and claim the little boon which Providence assigns them. So the birds are looking for just a little bit of seed on the ground in order to survive the winter. One alone, the red breast, sacred to the household gods, wisely regardful of the embroiling sky and joyless fields and thorny thickets, leaves his shivering mates. And what does he do? And pays to trusted man his annual visit. So what we have is the robin, who is willing to come into the yard, and he's going to be fed by the children and those who love robins. Now first the robin is a little hesitant, half afraid he first against the window beats. Then brisk alights on the warm hearth. Then hopping o'er the floor, eyes all the family, smiling family askance. Once the family sees the bird, they're going to protect it. They're going to look upon it as a pet, and they're really going to feed it. Robin Redbreast is willing to come to trusted man. All this family looks at him askance and pecks, and he starts and wonders where he is. But they begin to make him comfortable, till more familiar grown, the table crumbs attract his slender feet. The foodless wilds pour forth their brown inhabitants. And consequently, the robin can get food while others are foraging for the little that's left outside. Not a bad image, not a bad sign of affection, not a bad understanding of the relationship between the symbiosis of man and animal, man and bird. But life is not so pleasant. For the man, the worker who loses his way in the winter storm. And let's look at that. Here we have him. As thus the snows arise, and this is a man in a cart, or a man coming home from shopping in the village, man coming home from the fair, man coming home from work. As thus the snows arise and foul and fierce, all winter drives along the darkened air. In his own loose revolving fields, the swain disastered stands. The word disaster is not a verb. But Thompson, like Milton as a Latinist, turns it around and makes it a verb. The man disastered stand. Well, it's actually a adjectival accompanying the verb stands. The swain disastered. He is encountering disaster. He's going to get lost in the storm. He's going to be subsumed by the storm. The storm is going to, and the poet describes him as a man who is disastered, who is going to suffer the ultimate end in the storm. As the storm forms around him, he loses sight of where he should be. He loses direction. He sees other hills ascend. Line 280. Sees other hills ascend of unknown joyless brow, and other scenes of horrid prospect shag the trackless plain. Now he can't find the river. He can't find the forest. He doesn't know the difference. He's afraid he might step into water or fall into a pond as soon as step on dry land. Nor finds the river, line 282. Nor finds the river, nor the forest, hid beneath the formless wild. But he wanders on from hill to dale, still more and more astray. He thinks he's heading home. He's not getting there. Impatient, flouncing through the drifted heaps, stung with the thoughts of home. The thoughts of home rush on his nerves. Now, the thoughts of home rush on his nerves and call their vigor forth. Of course, when someone's freezing, it's the nerve endings of your fingers, the nerve endings of your toes, the nerve endings of your ears the nerve endings of your nose that freeze first, and slowly your vessel, this body of vessel, begins to freeze from the outside in. They rush on his nerves and call their vigor forth in many a vain attempt. How sinks his soul? What black despair, what horror fills his heart, when for the dusky spot which fancy feigned his tufted cottage rises, he thinks he sees his cottage rising through the snow. And so he rushes toward it. But instead, he meets the roughness of the middle waste, far from the track and blessed abode of man. And he falls into covered pits. He falls deep. He falls into the snow. He can't tell what is land and what is water, and therefore he proceeds more carefully, and the more carefully he proceeds, the more he's freezing. These check his fearful steps, and down he sinks beneath the shelter of These check his fearful steps, and down he sinks beneath the shelter of the shapeless drift, thinking o'er all the bitterness of death, mixed with the tender anguish nature shoots through the wrung bosom of the dying man. So he has fallen. He is dying. His nerve endings are freezing. His arms, his chest, his inner organs are slowly freezing. And what is the pathos? Who's waiting for him? His wife, his children, and his friends unseen. In vain for him, the officious wife prepares the fire fair blazing and the vestment warm. His wife always expects him home, has the fire going for him, has warm clothes for him to change into. Line 310, his wife, his children, and his friends unseen. In vain for him, the officious wife prepares the fire fair blazing and the vestment warm. In vain his little children, peeping out into the mingling storm, demand their sire with tears of artless innocence, "Where's Daddy? Why isn't he home? When is he going to come home?" You get this incredible sense of despair, frustration, horror. And you empathize with the family and the children. Alas, nor wife nor children more shall he behold, nor friends nor sacred home. What happened to him? On every nerve the deadly winter seizes, shuts up sense, and o'er his inmost vitals creeping cold lays him along the snows, a stiffened corpse, stretched out and bleaching in the northern blast. Well, there you have it. There you have the death of the farmer, the cottager, the husband, the father, caught in winter storm. Thompson worries about people who are in poverty and cannot protect themselves against the winter storm. He calls poverty cheerless poverty. People can't be happy when they have no fuel, when they have no way of protecting themselves from the storm. Another aspect of winter deals with the prison reform system. Thompson was upset that the prisons were badly run and prisoners were being oppressed. And so in winter, he talks about a prison reform committee that was trying to change the views of the prisons. And here can I forget the generous band who, touched with human woe, redressive, searched into the horrors of the gloomy jail. This is where people are thrown in jail and no one pays attention to them. Unpitied and unheard, where misery moans, where sickness pines, where thirst and hunger burn, they're not fed, they're not given water, unless they have to pay the guards. And we find that these guards are criminal in the fact that they will beat their prisoners, rob them of their money, rob them of their health, rob them of their clothing. This is where sickness pines, where thirst and hunger burn, and poor misfortune feels the lash of vice, while in the land of liberty, the land whose every street and public meeting glow with open freedom. While in the land of liberty, the land whose every street and public meeting glow with open freedom, little tyrants raged, and those are the prison guards who snatched the lean morsel from the starving mouth, tore from cold wintry limbs the tattered weave clothing, even robbed them of their last comforts, sleep. And he said, these people in prison, if they were released, would be better off and more willing to defend their country. Here they're in jail, useless, tortured, maimed, reduced to poverty. Here you have the freeborn Briton to the dungeon chained, or as the lust of cruelty prevailed. The freeborn Briton to the dungeon chained, or as the lust of cruelty prevailed, at pleasure marked him with inglorious stripes, and crushed out lives, that is the guards beating the prisoners, and crushed out lives by secret barbarous ways that for their country would have toiled or bled. Here you have James Thompson speaking to the committee designed to repair the prisons and addressing the people who allow prisons to sustain themselves without attention, without support, without training the guards, without compassion, where prisoners who could in fact serve their country will die in prison, shamelessly and in poverty. So the poem Winter by James Thompson is also a psychological poem. It's a poem that deals with the human condition in England or in the world in the 18th century or in the 21st century. The poem has meaning to us today, facing the same problems and sometimes the same conditions. Now I'd like to turn to our next poet, who is William Cullens. William Cullens is a psychological poet. He gives us a number of poems: Ode to Fear, Ode to Pity, Ode to Evening. But we're going to look at just several poems that you have. One is the Ode to Fear. And I want to look at that poem. Now, Ode to Fear is basically a Pandoric poem. It's divided into three stanzas. Normally, as you would have in the early Greek choir, you would have the strophe, the antistrophe, and the epode. The type of poem you're looking at is identified as the Pandoric Ode, and it was initiated by Pindar, the Greek poet, who lived from 522 to 443 BC, and there is his name in the Greek, Pindaros. Let's look at this poem and see what Cullens is telling us. He starts by saying, "Thou to whom the world unknown with all its shadowy shapes is shown, who seest appalled the unreal scene while fancy lifts the veil between." Ah, fear. Ah, frantic fear. Now, what is fear all about? I see thee near. I know thy hurried step, thy haggard eye. Like thee I start, like thee disordered fly. And you get this emotion, this fear, this tremulous action when someone is hesitant to move, fearful of moving, wary of moving, when you sidle away from a scene that might cause you a certain problem. Or you never go to a scene where you might think you will be experiencing fear. Disordered, disarranged, deranged. Fear turns people, tears them inside out. He talks about the danger we encounter. He says, danger throws a person or throws an individual on the ridgy steep of some loose hanging rock to sleep, and to sleep forever. So you encounter danger, and you fear danger. That's why you seldom walk narrow mountain paths. You chart where you're going before you go. Years ago, Bishop Pike, an Episcopal bishop, fell off one of the Judean mountains, was dashed to death below. There's always danger. Sometimes you avoid danger, sometimes you want danger. And then he describes vengeance. Whilst vengeance in the lurid air lifts her red arm, exposed and bare. When people seek revenge, they want blood, and the blood appears on vengeance's arm. So what you have is a poem giving you a complete sense of fear. Let's look at that poem in 9:18. Thou to whom the world unknown with all its shadowy shapes is shown, who seest appalled the unreal scene, while fancy lifts the veil between, you imagine what's going to happen. Ah, fear, ah, frantic fear, I see thee near. I know thy hurried step, thy haggard eye. Like thee I start, like thee, disordered fly. For lo, what monsters in thy train appear. Now here we come. Who are they? Danger and vengeance. Danger, whose limbs of giant mold, what mortal eye can fixed behold? Who stalks his round in hideous form, howling amidst the midnight storm? Or throws him on the ridgy steep of some loose hanging rock to sleep? And with him 1,000 phantoms joined, who prompt to deeds accursed the mind. Who prompt to deeds accursed the mind. We're worried about who's going to hurt us, who's going to shoot us, who's going to attack us. And those the fiends who near allied o'er nature's wounds and wrecks preside, they preside over the ruin of human beings. Whilst vengeance in the lurid air lifts her red arm exposed and bare, on whom that ravening brood of fate who lapped the blood of sorrow wait, who fear this ghastly train can see. And who fear this ghastly train can see, and look not madly wild like thee. What a deeply psychological poem. I was at the Boston Public Library several years ago and entered an ornate elevator that was to lead me to the 3rd floor where the rare book room is located. And just as the door was about to enter, a woman came in who was small and shaken and terrified. And she moved herself into a corner of this elegant gilded elevator. And the first thing she said was, "Don't hurt me." I was startled. She says, "I was crossing the street and they were trying to hurt me. Don't hurt me." And I never have seen a woman so fearful and so disordered in my life. The elevator door opened on the second floor, and I departed at that moment, leaving her to her claustrophobia or to whatever fears may have entered her mind and forced her into this terrified situation. The epode moves on to a more intellectual vein, less emotional. What we have in the epode is a declaration of those writers who dealt with problems of fear. Aeschylus, in 525 to 456, who wrote a number of plays, including the Eumenides, which dealt with the Furies. And he mentions Sophocles, who lived from 495 to 406 BC, who wrote Oedipus, and speaks of the incestuous queen. Now look how he handles that scene. In earliest Greece, to thee with partial choice, the griefful muse, that's fearful muse, addressed her infant tongue. Who are these people expressing their infant tongue? These are the tragic playwrights who are describing the faults and the despair of men who have risen to power, who are going to fall. But who is he, whom later garlands grace, who left a while o'er Hebla's dews to rove, with trembling eyes thy dreary steps to trace, where thou and Furies shared the baleful grove? He's now talking about a play, how play creates a catharsis. We watch plays so that we don't experience the crimes, the failures, the fears that those on the on the stage experience. They do for us what we don't want to have happen to us ourselves. Wrapped in thy cloudy veil, the incestuous queen sighed the sad call. Her son and husband heard. And that, of course, is Laius' wife, who married her son unwittingly, for he had killed his father on the road to Thebes unwittingly. You know the story of Oedipus. Freud knew it and took advantage of it to describe man's emotions and man's will to power. Finally, the last part of this poem, Ode to Fear, celebrates Shakespeare. When ghosts as cottage maids believe, their pebbled beds permitted leave. And we speak about the ghosts in Macbeth. And so the poem not only gives us a sense of the problems we face, but it gives us a sense, too, of the emotions, the psychology, the capability of the poet to probe our minds and discover our deepest thoughts. I want to look at another poem by Cullens, the Ode on the Poetical Character. Now the question is, who writes poetry, and what is poetry all about? Poets write about themselves, they write about nature, they write about the Godhead, but then they have to write about how they themselves write. And there are geniuses among poets, and there are people who write mediocre poetry. But the question is, what gives people the inspiration to write the way they do? So let's look at the poem the Ode on the Poetical Character. Now, this poem, as all of Cullens' poems, have a certain rhythm, a certain spirit, an attempt to capture the ethereal and the sublime. And so he often works with uneven lines, or he works with sonorous lines that almost give us a symphony, almost gives us music. But I want to look at the Ode of the Poetical Character first and tell you what's essential in each of these strophes. We again have 3 stanzas, and we look upon them as the Pandoric stanzas, giving us great emotion, divided into meaningful corpora. The Ode to the Poetical Character. First of all, we begin with a tribute to poetry in number 1. We're dealing with the Pandoric Ode. And the highest aim of a poet, or the highest achievement of a poet, according to Cullens, in this sense, is Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. You've read in studies this multifaceted tribute to Queen Elizabeth, the praise of the Anglican Church, and the attack on the Roman Catholic Church. The second stanza deals with the rich-haired youth of morn, and that is always the Apollonian myth. Whenever you see a rich-haired youth, he has golden hair, and that is Apollo, the god of poetry. Perhaps the most important Apollonian poet was John Keats. And Walter Everett years ago wrote a book about the evolution of Keats's poetry, in which he discusses the Apollonian myth and concludes by spending a great deal of time with the poem To Autumn, because autumnal images are the golden grain and the harvest all represent the Apollonian. Stanza 3 begins to celebrate modern poets. Among them, John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, and we get some feeling of John Milton's poetry there. We also get the celebration of Edmund Waller's poetry, where the myrtle represents Venus, the goddess of love. So knowing that you have these 3 parts of the poem, number 1 celebrates the Faerie Queene and classical poetry. Number 2 represents the classical poetry and poetry in general with the Apollonian myth. And stanza 3 recognizes the greatest poet who emerged in the late 17th century, John Milton, with Paradise Lost. Well, let's see how this reads and how the poet transforms this into the magic of his language. He begins by saying, as once, if not with light regard, I read aright that gifted bard, him whose school above the rest his loveliest elfin queen has blessed, Spenser, one, only one, unrivaled fair, might hope the magic girdle wear, that solemn tourney hung on high, the witch of each love-darting eye. And now we get the image, of course, of Florimel with a magic belt. We remember Red Cross Knight, and we get the heroic medieval images. Even though Spenser wrote at the same time as Shakespeare, his language seems archaic because he wanted to give it a medieval flavor. Now, what does poetry do? Lo, to each other nymph in turn applied, as if at air unseen some hovering hand, there's always a hand that is inspired, Some chaste and angel friend to virgin fame, with whispered spell had burst the starting band. Now, the point is that whatever the myth is, whatever the story the poet wants to tell, the hand becomes independent of the story. Where do we get our inspiration? Stanza 2. And this is pure magic, these words. Pure lyric. You won't find anything else like it in the 18th century. The band, as fairy legends say, was wove on that creating day, when he who called with thought to birth yon tented sky, this laughing earth, and dressed with springs and forests tall, and poured the main and girding all, long by the loved enthusiast wooed, himself in some diviner mood. What's he talking about there? He's talking about creation. Cullens is saying that the Bible is the first great poetry of the world. There's fairy legends that created the Bible, but he suggests that the imagination and the fancy stems biblically. Because when he says, the band, as fairy legends say, was wove on that creating day, that's Genesis, the creating day, when he who called with thought to birth, that's God, yon tented sky, this laughing earth. Now, why is the sky tented? The sky is tented, and particularly this magnificent Texas sky. When you're driving through the countryside and you don't have telephone wires, and you don't have electric wires, and you don't have buildings in the way, and you just see this half globe of a sky, you feel as though you are under a tent, a vast tent. And this laughing earth. Why does the earth laugh? The word laugh is biblical. Remember when Sarah discovered that she was pregnant at the age of 90? She laughed because how can a woman that old be pregnant? And she gave birth to a son, and she called him Isaac. And Isaac, Yitzchak, means laughter in the Hebrew. Laughter. So that any woman who brings forth a child can laugh. But the earth is a female. The earth is Mother Earth. And when you plant a seed in Mother Earth, she becomes the epitome of fruition. You have corn, and you have trees, and you have tomatoes, and you have lettuce, and you have cabbage. You have all kinds of food generating, all kinds of fruition generating from earth. And so earth is laughing because she is pregnant, always pregnant, and ready to deliver from the seed new fruit, new life, new habitation. All right. Here we have the poet, himself in some diviner mood. Retiring sat with her alone, his inspiration, enthusiasm. Seraphic wires were heard to sound. That is, you hear the music of the angels. Now sublimest triumph swelling, now on love and mercy dwelling. So if you are dwelling on the sublimest triumph, then you're dealing with sublime poetry, biblical poetry, lyric poetry, the poetry of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid. Now on love and mercy dwelling. This could be Marvell's To His Coy Mistress. It could be Donne's The Flea. It could be minor poetry in the Bible. And mercy dwelling, of course, could be Thompson's The Seasons. And she from out the veiling cloud breathed her magic notes aloud. That's the inspiration. And thou, here comes the Apollo myth. And thou rich-haired youth of morn, and all thy subject life was born. Well, that's the essence of poetry. Now let's turn to the last stanza, where we recognize the poetry of Milton and the poetry of Waller, two poets whom Cullens wishes to celebrate. High on some cliff, once we see we're high on a cliff, we're looking at Adam, looking over the future of the world with the archangel. High on some cliff, to heaven uppiled, of rude excess of prospect wild, where tangled round the jealous steep, strange shadows o'erbrawl the valley deep, and holy genii guard the rock in glooms and brown, its springs unlock, while on its rich, ambitious head an Eden like his own lies spread. And once you have a high mountains, and once you have an Eden, you know you're talking about Milton. Well, he doesn't keep you guessing. I view that oak, the fancied glades among, by which as Milton lay his evening ear, for many a cloud that dropped the ethereal dew, nigh sphered in heaven, its native strain could hear. So now you have Milton, celebrated, and next, of course, thither oft his glory greeting, from Waller's myrtle shades retreating with many a vow, from hope's aspiring tongue, my trembling feet his guiding steps pursue. So I would like to be a poet, and I too would like to step in this inspiration. I too would like to be part of this poetic world. We read in the newspapers that American soldiers engaged in battle are dying in places like Baghdad and Iraq. Before that, in Vietnam and Korea. And we wonder what kinds of poems people could write in honor of these brave men who have died. Here's a poem that Cullens wrote. In 1746, it was published in 1747. England was engaged in British wars in 1745 and 46, and they were defeated. They were defeated May 1745 at Fontenoy in Belgium by the French. And they were defeated in 1745 and 46 in battles with the Scots in Scotland, in Prestonpans, Scotland, and Falkirk. What kind of poem can you write to honor the soldiers who have died in battle, victorious or in defeat? We need our poets again to celebrate the lives of those who give the ultimate sacrifice. And here's a poem by William Cullens. First stanza. How sleep the brave who sink to rest, by all their country's wishes blessed. When spring with dewy fingers cold returns to deck their hallowed mold, she there shall dress a sweeter sod than fancy's feet have ever trod. Because you're the grave, because the grave is underfoot, the soil is more precious than it ever has been. By fair hands their knell is rung. By forms unseen their dirge is sung. We're going to celebrate their death. Their honor comes, a pilgrim gray, to bless the turf that wraps their clay. And freedom shall a while repair, to dwell a weeping hermit there. Freedom has not yet been found in these places because the English were defeated. And freedom shall a while repair, to dwell a weeping hermit there. It's a rather important poem, only because I want to see poems like this written today, when we have soldiers on the battlefield who deserve the attention of the poets and the memorials of the poets that last as long as these lines last, 250 years, to honor these dead. I'd like to look at two quick poems. First of all, William Cullens' Ode to Evening. What happens when evening comes? If you live in the countryside, you're going to see bats come about and beetles, and you're going to hear sounds at night, particularly at twilight. I want to just give you this poem, which is not in your text, but this is one of Cullens' great poems. It's called The Ode to Evening. If aught of oaten stop or pastoral song may hope chaste Eve to soothe thy modest ear. Now this is evening. Chaste Eve, Eve has not been ravished in any way. Like thy own solemn springs, thy springs and dying gales, O nymph reserved. While now the bright-haired sun sits in yon western tent, whose cloudy skirts with braid ethereal wove o'erhang his white wavy bed. So the sun is setting. The cloudy skirts, the sky is now covering the sun. Now look at this image. Those of you who've been outside in the countryside during the winter, during the summer, know what we're talking about here. Now air is hushed, save where the weak-eyed bat with short, shrill shriek flits by on leathern wing, and you see that movement, or where the beetle winds his small but sullen horn, as off the rises midst the twilight path. As of the rises midst the twilight path. Let's move on here to... And lead calm votris where some sheety lake. The lake is like a sheet. It's so quiet. A sheet of glass. Then lead calm votris, that's evening, where some sheety lake cheers the lone heath, or some time-hallowed pile, or upland fallows gray reflect its cool gleam. What I want you to remember here are lines that only Cullens could write. Now air is hushed, save where the weak-eyed bat with short, shrill shriek flits by on leathern wing, or where the beetle winds his small but sullen horn. We have but a few moments. I'd like to go back to Thompson for a poem that I want you to look at that we have not looked at. It's not in your text, but I think it's really quite important. And this is Thompson's poem to the memory of Sir Isaac Newton. We're going to return now to Thompson. We're going to conclude with a scientific view of the greatest scientist who lived in the 18th century, perhaps one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, Sir Isaac Newton. You know him for having understood the principles of gravity. We've already mentioned his use in Gulliver's Travels. But this poem by Thompson celebrates modernity. It celebrates invention. It celebrates the scientific spirit which was evolving in the 18th century. It deals with 6 concepts. 1, Newton, who has died, is now in his milieu. He's amidst the stars. He's now going to be part of this cosmos that we are going to understand. The concept, 2, is that Providence creates a universal frame. There is an order to the universe that Newton has given us. An order to the universe that we have not understood before. Concept 3 is the laws of gravity that help us understand what it's all about. Concept 4 is the harmonious whole. The belief that there's a real understanding that this world is a unified, meaningful existence. Concept 5 deals us with the rainbow because Newton wrote a text called The Optics. And concept 6 is the saving grace of science. What science has given us. Let's look through that. Newton in his milieu. Shall the great soul of Newton quit this earth to mingle with his stars, and every muse astonished into silence shun the weight of honors due his illustrious name? And what new wonders can ye show your guests? What can the world show Newton? He knows it all. Who, while on this dim spot where mortals toil, clouded in dust from motion's simple laws, he could trace the secret hand of providence, wide working through the universal frame. There is order in the universe, and Milton gives it to us. The laws of gravity, he mentions. You have his amazing mind attended with heroic patience, years and years of study, deep searching, saw at last the system dawn. And so there's a system, and the system is gravitational. Concept 4, all intellectual eye, our solar round, first gazing through, he, by the blended power of gravitation and projection, saw the whole. So he understands the whole of the world. The rainbow. We have the colors. When he put the prism in the window, he showed us first the flaming red, the tawny orange, the delicious yellow, the all-refreshing green, the pure blue, the deepened indigo, all this part of the refracted light that Milton showed us in the rainbow. And finally, the end. Britain's boast, whether with angels thou sittest in dread discourse, or fellow blessed, who joy to see the honor of their kind. Here we have one who gave us light himself. Be her genius called. You are God's genius. Her studies raise. Let's raise science. Correct her manners, inspire youth. What is the dignity of the world? The scientist. The scientist, Newton, capable of raising new studies, his genius showing the world in a new light, providing the world with new knowledge and new insight. A man now dead, but who will live in the stars and who will explain to the angels themselves and to men always who study his works and his precepts and his scientific method how the world is supposed to operate. Thank you.